I'll just talk a little briefly now about the globalisation of AG. And it's almost certainly true that the push towards globalisation in higher education is related to the development of business schools, to MBA, the promissory allure of MBA programs, the financial clout of accountancy, and so on and so forth. And it's most certainly the case at the institution I'm based, where the business school, leaders in the business school boasted of the way in which they were going to, in inverted commas, conquer India with the development of a new educational program out there. I've been involved for a number of years with an educational link with a private university in Egypt. It's called the process, I'm involved in the process known as validation, whereby the university I work at scrutinises the programs that the host university operates and kind of evaluates it according to current quality assurance standards. The idea is if the institution is validated, it can then award British university qualifications. The theory being that the institution is then equivalent somehow to the British institution. Essentially, this process is an auditing process. It's an application of auditing principles to the appraisal of degree programs. The idea being that it increases transparency in the institution and therefore allows us to have a better understanding of what's going on there. I would argue, though, that a failure to consider the issue of translation between institutions and between practices in fact results in an increase in opacity rather than transparency. The reality of an outsourced higher education link is really one of neatly defined, neatly packaged outcomes. The reality is that culturally specific teaching methods, inevitable translation barriers arising from people teaching and learning in a second language, organisational practice, commercial motivations and so on, result in things such as grade inflation and a general lack, not so much of parity of standards, but of any serious basis on which to compare and talk about educational institutions in two countries. What's really interesting for me, and this is how I kind of got involved in doing more research about this, is that the problems that arise from the kind of quality audit, delivery-led conception of education that is applied in outsourced programs first became visible for me on humanities-related media and media arts programs. There's a story here which I can't go into, which concerns the way in which these kinds of links operate, and what happens if you have annual visits by external examiners that work in a very similar way to the visit of an external examiner to a domestic institution. Problems became evident at the university that I was working at very quickly in the media programs, but they had not become evident on some of the other programs, which were business studies, degrees, computing science, and so on and so forth. One of the reasons for this has to do with the kind of knowledge and teaching practices that staff engage in. On a degree in computing, one can almost dispense with written language, and the problems one is required to tackle generally admit of solutions known in advance. This is somewhat similar for an accounting or human resource management degree. But this is often not the case for a creative degree in media, where one is required to engage on sensibility, draw on culturally specific knowledges, tackle questions of power and so on. In a country such as Egypt, it is not possible simply to enjoin people to express themselves or to speak freely, because there are some very serious power issues there that would have to be addressed for students to feel comfortable to do that. More particularly, it's impossible to get away from questions of language. So despite excellent levels of spoken English by many of my colleagues in Egypt, and the shameful lack of Arabic on the part of English academics, myself included, much of the way in which organisational discussions, to say nothing of teaching, takes place is in an attenuated global English, which is often reduced to a bastardised parody of the already parodic language of excellence and quality. But this issue is an issue that is rarely, if ever, raised. It's rarely thematised by my colleagues. It's rarely thematised by people who are responsible for quality assurance. Perhaps because Globish, as Global English is being called nowadays, is the language of business, it is the language of administration, and it is the language of technocratic decision-making. I think it's worth pointing out that part of the impetus behind outsourced education is very much to do with the training of new workforces. I mean, this is not a fact that hasn't been known. It's actually quite well known. A number of the institutions that have been set up, that I've known about recently, have been set up in so-called knowledge villages or in free trade zones in certain parts of the Middle East. The idea being that an outsourced education program trains up a workforce to do media-related, creative work for businesses that are then invested in by companies from Great Britain. So that it is possible that there are some vested interests in not opening up the question of cultural particularity or the singularity of the relationship between cultures that occurs in a globalised classroom. So I think that, I'll just round off here, I think that the issue of translation, of translatability, and of the assumption that cultural educational practices around the world can be translated into the language of the British educational institution is an issue that has to be tackled, and it has to be tackled head on. And it's not something that uniquely occurs abroad. I would suggest, and I'll just come back to where I started, I would suggest that the issue of the presence of students in the classroom, the pedagogical relationship that we establish with them, is absolutely central to this process of translation and translatability.